Hey folks, welcome back. On today's episode, we are going to be going over how to make a handle for a full tang knife. So in part one, we are going to be attaching the handle scales to the actual knife. And then in part two, I'm going to go in depth with shaping and all that stuff. So stay tuned and we'll get started. Okay, we're over here at the workbench, and this is going to be a fairly in-depth series. This is how I do things, and I'm a full-time knife maker, so this is kind of what I've come up with so far. Things are constantly evolving, but this is kind of my process. So we have our knife. This is a Damascus chef knife. It's going to be pretty sick when it's all done. Here's the handle material. Now, when you're starting on a full tang knife, you're going to use what's called scales. These are scales. They are about anywhere from 3/8 to 1/2 inch thick, and they can be any material you want. These are flame walnut, which is a particularly nice piece of walnut. I do say so myself. So we're going to need the knife, the two scales, and this is a fairly simple handle. There's no bolsters or liners or anything. And then we're going to be, instead of pins, which would just be a rod going through the handle to secure it, we're going to be using these. Now, these are called Corby bolts, and as you can see, they have two parts. They have a male and female end, and what these do is they give you the look of having a pin, which I think is really nice, but you have the mechanical advantage of the handle actually being screwed onto the knife. So it's a very, very secure way to attach the handle to a knife along with the glue. Another thing I've also done, and it's really easy to get these things mixed up, is I have written on each scale which direction they go and which side they go on, and that's so I don't get them mixed up. So what we're going to go ahead and do now is start drilling out our pinholes. So we're now over at the drill press. Got our knife, got our two scales, and I have the female ends of the Corby bolts, and we're going to be using these as locator pins, and you'll see that in a sec. I have a 3/16 of an inch drill bit in the chuck, and that is the right diameter for the post of the Corby bolt. And I'm going to do the scales individually. So I'm going to put it on there where I want it, and then I really like to use these little spring clamps. They're just enough to keep it from wiggling around, and they're easy to pull on and off and easy to fit in here, which are 1, 2, 3 blocks. You could also use a drill press vise. We want something we can hold the knife up off the table so we can drill all the way through. It's important when we get close to the end that we do not push too hard, because you don't want to blow out the back of the hole. Alright, so now we've drilled our first hole. What I'm going to do is take the half of the Corby bolt with the post on it and just drop it into that hole we made. And that's so if the tang shifts around a little bit when we're drilling our next hole, we do not get them out of alignment. So I'll switch it over just like this, and then we'll drill out our second one. Just like that. And we'll put this one in, make sure everything's perfect, and then we're going to do the exact same thing with the other scale. Something I like to do just to keep everything lined up, especially if it's a book matched set of scales. Book matching meaning when you open up the scales, they're the same on each side, is I actually like to start the holes while the scales are together so they can match up. So what I'll do is I'll clamp them together, and then I'll just drill just a touch down in each so I can line up the tang of the knife with the rest of the handle. Just a little bit like that. And what you'll see is now we have our two marks to know where to put our tang. So we'll go ahead and line these up, and then that should make it to where when the actual handle is together, that there's not one scale that's kind of all wonky. So that was only half the drilling. What we need to now do is use what is called a step drill, and you can either buy these or make them. They're really easy to make. It's made from a 1/4 inch diameter drill bit, and it's ground down to 3/16 at the tip. And what that will do is, how these Corby bolts work, is there is this shoulder right there, and that shoulder when this is screwed together is what's bringing the scales together and bolting them down. So now we need to create that shoulder. What we'll do now is we have the inside, we're going to flip it over to where we're drilling from the outside, and we're going to drill it so this Corby bolt can fit in there. Now, how far you drill is dependent on a lot of things. It's dependent on mostly how thick your tang is. And now I do all tapered tang, so it's kind of a guesstimate. So what I'll do is I'll bring the chuck down to probably around 1/8 of an inch. That's a good starting point. And then I will set the drill press lock so I don't go deeper than that. And then what we'll do is we'll drill in on all of them and check. And it's a little easier to go not quite enough and do a little more later. Okay, so now just confirming again, we're drilling from the outside of the scale, not the inside. We're going to go ahead and drill these out. So now we have a 1/4 inch hole on the outside of the scale and a 3/16 hole on the inside. And if we slip our Corby bolt down in there, you can see it butts up against that shoulder and we have a little bit sticking out. So what we need to do now is put the bolts in there, lay the tang on, and it looks like I did that perfectly, which doesn't always happen. We're just going to now drop the Corby bolt somewhere into the deep ether of my workshop. Okay, so once you have recovered your Corby bolt from the depths of the drill press base, what we need to do now is make sure we have the spacing right and be bolted together enough so it's secure. Take a flathead screwdriver and just screw this on together. That ended up going together perfectly. So now we are ready to shape the front of the scales, flatten the tang, and then we'll go from there. So what I've done is I have taken the handle off the knife and I have bolted it back together. So you can see it's now time to shape the front of the scales, and the reason why we're doing this now is once this is all glued up, there is no way in hell we're going to be able to shape this nicely. So I have a 36 grit belt on. I'm going to turn my dust collector on and be wearing a respirator, so I won't be talking much. But basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to be holding this on here and getting it to the desired shape I like. What I'm going to also be constantly doing is holding the tang up to where my pins are to make sure the front of the handle is ending up where I want it to be. Let's do that. So the front of the handle is now shaped how I like it, and you have the freedom to do whatever the heck you want with this shape. I just like a nice curve, and it's at the appropriate level behind where the plunge lines are, and I'm just overall really happy with its location. So next, and this is completely personal preference, I like to put a chamfer on the front edges of the scales. I think it looks really nice. It fits in the sheaths really well. Not that this isn't going to necessarily be in a sheath, but basically I'm going to hold it maybe about a 45-degree angle and then work at that same radius until I get a nice angle here, and that'll be easier to see once I've done it. So just like that. So this is still very rough, and that's okay for now because we're going to clean that up later. But now we need to start addressing the actual tang of the knife. So what I've done is I've put the handle back on, and with Corby's there is a lot of taking it on and taking it off and fussing around, but it's worth it. What I'm going to do now is take a fine tip Sharpie marker and mark out the exact shape of the front end of our scales. And since I do a brute to forge style blade, meaning I leave the hammer marks on the blade, it's critical for me to not grind that away because it's going to look really bad if I do. So That's why I'm so careful when I am doing these next few steps that I don't grind past this line. As you can see, our tang is pretty flat, and we're just creeping it up to that ground away portion, gets rid of all the hammer marks, to right at that line. So you'll notice we have a nice flat surface, and we've ground really close to that line. Now it's challenging with these brute forge blades because you can see there's a few hammer marks kind of back here, but we're trying to get as close as we can, and it's not going to be perfect obviously because this surface isn't perfect, but as long as you get it close and the majority of this is nice and flat, you're going to be pretty good. So we're going to go ahead and do the same thing on the other side, and then we're going to turn our attentions to these fullers. Okay, you'll see what I've done now is I've taken the flat platen on my belt grinder here and I've tilted it towards me so I can use this top idler wheel. Now for some reason I find I enjoy grinding fullers on a harder wheel. I don't know why, but that's just what I've kind of liked so far. And what we're going to be doing is cleaning up the fullers we've already put in the blade before heat treat, and I'm going to go into several reasons as to why I put a fuller in the tang. So first off, it makes tapering the tang a little easier because we only have to flatten around the fuller, so it's a little easier for that. Two, because we have created two ridges, much like an I-beam, it makes the tang a lot stiffer. As well as by removing this material, we are reducing some of the weight in the tang and shifting the balance point further forward. It also allows any excess epoxy we might have to fill this gap so we have more chemical adhesion on the blade. So I have a 60 grit belt on here. What I'm going to do is just clean up all the heat treat scale and crud on there and bring that fuller forward a little bit more. I'll do a separate video on how I do the fullers more in depth, but that's all the reasons why I do it. Okay, so now that we have our tang fullered and flattened, what I'm going to do, and these disc grinders are a fantastic tool to have. It's one of those things where you kind of wonder how you got by without it. But what I'm going to do, and this is 80 grit, and that's what I like all my gluing surfaces to be at. It seems like it's rough enough for the glue to really hold, but not too rough. So I'm just going to go ahead and touch these off, make sure they're nice and flat, because the level of flatness we have is really important for the longevity of the handle. Just like that, and then I can test them together, and if there are no gaps like there aren't here, then you have a pretty flat piece of wood. The last thing we need to do before cleaning up the front ends of these is to check it with the actual handle to make sure there are no gaps as well. So what I'll do is I'll lay it on here, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold it up to where a light is behind it, and if I can see any gaps in the majority of the handle, it means things are not flat and I need to address that immediately. One thing I will mention is right in this area where there is sometimes a little forge texture between your handle material and the blade, sometimes that will show just the tiniest bit of a gap, but that's okay. There's nothing we can really do to get around that unless we had a fully ground blade, and as long as it's really small and the smallest you can get it, I see no problem with that. And I see none. I'm just going to do the same thing on the other side. No gaps there either, so that's looking great. The reason I'm sharing this is because I struggled for a long time to figure out how to get the tangs flat, and I'm hoping it helps some of you kind of skip that step and just share what I've learned. Okay, so we are back at the grinder with now a 400 grit belt on here, and what I'm going to do for the 150th time is put the scales back together, and then the exact same motions we used when using that 36 grit belt to shape up the front here, I'm going to do the exact same thing with this 400 grit belt, and that'll give us a really nice finish that we can then hand sand over to create an even better finish. So this is the level of finish we have after the 400 grit belt. It's okay, but it's gonna look a hell of a lot nicer if we hand sand it. So what I'm gonna do is just take a piece of 400 grit sandpaper and then just kind of smooth out any facets and lines we have from the belt grinder. And that'll just look really, really nice. Just kind of blend everything together. So now we are ready to one final step before we start gluing this guy up. And that's going to be buffing. And this is a completely optional step. I would only recommend doing this on woods that are on the darker side. Blonder woods like maple and birch and stuff, if they're unstabilized, this buffing compound will kind of make them look really dark and muddy. So not good. So I'm just going to use a little white compound. And then we're just going to hit the front and just give it a really nice lustrous sheen. Alright, just like that. It's now nice and glossy, and you won't really see this portion too well on the finished knife, but if you're going to make it nice, make it nice. Okay, we're going to start gluing this up now. What I like to use are just dish gloves because I can reuse them, so I'm not wasting a whole bunch of gloves, and I just kind of wipe my hands down with a little bit of acetone at the end just to get rid of some of the sticky glue. We are ready to get started. So I have some C-clamps. I have our glue. I like to use this West Systems G-Flex epoxy. It's expensive, but it's the best stuff out there. And cleanliness is a really important part of gluing. So I have some acetone on a paper towel here. And I'm just going to wipe everything down pretty thoroughly with this stuff to make sure that there are no oils or any gunk on here left from my hands or any of the other processes we have done. I'll do the same thing with the scales. And you'll notice if you end up using oily woods that you'll actually remove some of the oil from the woods with the acetone, which is kind of cool. But this walnut isn't super oily. And then I'm just going to clean off the bolts just to remove any gunk that might be on them as well. Just like that. What we're going to do now is start mixing up our epoxy. And I like to not use tons and tons of epoxy. I like to use enough. And that's something you just kind of got to get the feel for over time. And I like to mix up my epoxy on these old disc sanding discs. They're just pieces of sandpaper. They're being thrown away anyway, so might as well, instead of using a new piece of material to do this, might as well use up what's already going in the trash. Mix up our epoxy here. This is a 2-part epoxy, so you try and get it as even as you can with the amounts. And now what I'm going to do is mix this stuff. And when it comes to mixing epoxy, in my experience, if you think it's done, mix it a little more. And then when you think it's done then it's probably good. Gonna give this a good mix for a couple, maybe like 1 or 2 minutes. Make sure it's really thoroughly mixed. And then we can start slathering this stuff all over our handle. It is now time to start gluing up this handle. So what I'm gonna first do is put a layer of epoxy on each scale. And try and get it a little bit everywhere. I'm gonna do the same thing on the other one. And now we can start putting in our Corby bolts. And the important thing with any pin is that you get enough epoxy down in the hole. So I'll just grab some on there, kind of wiggle it around, maybe get a little more if I need to, and then I'll stick it in there and make sure that thing has a lot of glue going on with it. Same thing on all of them. So now we got our bolts in there. Now what I do is I take any extra glue I have and I use my finger, and I'm just going to spread that on the Tang, into that fuller, into those weight reducing holes. And the reason I do that is might as well use the rest of the glue we have, as well as the more glue that's in there, the better. So that's all done. Lay the Tang onto one of the handle pieces, put the other one on top, and then we can go ahead and screw the handle together. This is what we got going on. I'm not going to tighten up the Corby bolts all the way right now. I'm going to do that once the clamps are on here. And I usually use 3 clamps, one in the middle, one in the back, and one in the front. And the important thing when gluing up a knife handle is we want epoxy to be in there. We don't want to squeeze it all out. So we do not want to clamp these down super tight. So I'll get one on here. And I'll just use 2 fingers. And once it gets kind of hard to turn, I'll just leave it there. Because we just want the clamps to be there to hold everything in place while the glue sets. Alright, at this point, I'm just going to now snug up the Corby bolts all the way. And this handle will never be going anywhere. Our handle has been clamped up, and you'll notice we have some glue squeezing out of the front here. And we need to get that off of there now, so it does not harden there and look A, really bad, or B, if we do try and get it off, we don't want to damage the blade. So just a little more acetone on top of this rag here, and we will just wipe that stuff right off so it is not going to pose any issues in the future. Give my hands and the screwdriver just a little wipe off, make sure there's not a whole bunch of glue on there. And this handle is now going to sit for 24 hours, and then we'll do our shaping. Alright folks, I hope that was educational to you. That's just kind of how I do things. It's not necessarily the only way to do things, not necessarily the best way to do things, but that's just kind of how I do my handles. In the next video, I'm going to be going into depth on shaping, but that'll be another video. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Hope that was helpful, and we'll see you tomorrow.